Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah shir. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. We're continuing to learn Hilchas Yom Tov. We're in Siman Tov Kuvav, and we're going to begin today on Daf Kuf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph on the very top line. And I am hopeful that today we will do Kuf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph as well as Kuf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, and we'll pick up another day on the Dirshu schedule. So we had been discussing the halachas of being mafresh challah on Yom Tov, and we said that if somebody you're allowed to bake fresh challah on Yom Tov. If somebody mixes up a dough on Yom Tov, he's allowed to be mafresh challah. Just same way he's allowed to do the lisha, he's allowed to knead the dough, which is a malacha. Same way he's allowed to make a fire and he's allowed to bake the bread. All of these involve malachas that are ordinarily prohibited on Yom Tov. However, l'tzarech echel nefesh, you're allowed to do them. So too, when you knead a dough, you have to be mafresh challah, and you're allowed to be mafresh challah on Yom Tov if you mixed up that dough, if you kneaded that dough on Yom Tov. However, let's say you kneaded a dough on Erev Yom Tov, and you did not you weren't mafresh challah from that dough on Erev Yom Tov, then you are not allowed to be mafresh challah from that dough on Yom Tov, because you should have done it before Yom Tov. What's the problem with being mafresh challah? The problem is that it's nireh kemisakein. It looks like the malacha of makeh b'patish. It may also look like mekach umemkar. These are all things that we discussed previously. So if you need a dough before Yom Tov, you're not allowed to be mafresh challah from that dough on Yom Tov. Yesterday, the Ramah gave us an eitzah. He gave us one eitzah what to do. What do you do if you needed that dough before Yom Tov and now it's Yom Tov and you aren't mafresh challah? So the Ramah said what you can do is you can bake the challah. You could actually eat from the challah. If we're talking about chalas chutz la'aretz, if we're here in chutz la'aretz and this happens, so chalas chutz la'aretz technically is mutar ba'achila before the hafrashas challah. If what you do is you make sure to leave over a certain amount of the challah until after Yom Tov, and after Yom Tov, you'll be mafresh challah from that leftover amount, and you'll be mafresh to cover everything, what you ate already and what still remains. So that was the eitzah that the Ramah gave us yesterday. Today, on the top line of Kuf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, the Ramah gives us another eitzah. Says the Ramah, V'im roitze, if a person wants, Yuchal lolosh oid isa achas b'yom tov, v'yitzarfem yachad, another eitzah. What you could do is, if you have a dough that you needed before Yom Tov, so you can't be mafresh challah from that dough. But what you can do is, now on Yom Tov, need another dough. Make another dough that's chayiv in challah. And now, when you combine those two doughs together, continues the Ramah, v'yafresh me oisa isa, and now be mafresh challah from the new dough that you just needed on Yom Tov. And when you do that hafrasha, do a hafrasha gam al mashaloi gam al mashalosh me'erev Yom Tov. So you'll make a new dough on Yom Tov. And we said the halach is if you need a dough on Yom Tov, you're allowed to be mafresh challah from that dough on Yom Tov. So need a new dough now on Yom Tov. You're allowed to be mafresh challah. And when you go to be mafresh the challah, make sure that you have that dough and yesterday's dough, both of them in front of you. And when you're mafresh challah on the new dough, be mafresh not only for the new dough, be mafresh for the old dough as well. So you'll make one hafrasha, you'll take off one piece from the new dough, but enough to cover a hafrasha on the new dough and on the old dough at the same time. And he brings this down from the Haggas Maimoni, from the Mardechai. Beis Yosef brings it down in the name of Taisvis. Now let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah here. Let's take a look at Mishnah Berurah is Katan Chafei. V'im roitza yuchal. If you want, you can make up a new dough now on Yom Tov. Of course, says the Chavetz Chaim, Umayri, we must be discussing a case shetzarech la, where you need another dough. You can't just knead up a dough on Yom Tov because you want to have a kunz, you want to be able to be mafresh challah, but you don't need this bread at all. Then it's shaloi l'tzarech Yom Tov. What are you doing this for? What are you baking for? You're baking for the weekdays after Yom Tov. You're not allowed to do that. So Mayri shetzarech la. It has to be either a case where you need additional bread, or you want to have nice, warm, fresh bread. You're allowed to make warm, fresh bread l'tzarech Yom Tov, even if you have other bread that's not just as fresh. You're allowed to make fresher bread for Yom Tov. And that's why we don't care. Go ahead and knead yourself a new dough, because that's a tzarech Yom Tov, either because you need it or because you want to have really nice, fresh, warm challah. And now when you do the hafrasha, you'll cover even the hafrasha on the dough that you made on Erev Yom Tov. And the Chavetz Chaim tells us that even if we're dealing with chalas Eretz Yisrael is a chiyuv d'oraisa. Chalas Eretz Yisrael, there's no way to eat it. It's not mutter ba'achila before the hafrasha. So now when you make the hafrasha, you're really being misaken the dough. You might think that that's a real problem of nirike misaken. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you're allowed to use this eitzah even in the case of chalas Eretz Yisrael. Ois katan chavav. The Ramah said, if you want, you can make oid isa. You could knead a new dough now on Yom Tov. Now, when I read this in the Ramah, I told you that the new dough that you're going to need on Yom Tov has to be a dough that's chayiv and challah. Because what's the understanding of this? The understanding is I have a dough that I needed on Erev Yom Tov. I'm not allowed to be mafresh challah on that. So I'm going to make a new dough now on Yom Tov that's chayiv and hafrashas challah. And that hafrashas challah I'm allowed to do because that dough I needed on Yom Tov. And once I'm doing the hafrasha, I'll do a hafrasha to cover yesterday's dough as well. But the new dough that you make now on Yom Tov has to be a dough that's large enough to generate a chiyuv challah. If it's not large enough to generate a chiyuv challah, so what did you accomplish? The hafrashas challah that you're going to do now on Yom Tov is not for the new dough, it's only for the old dough. So it's the same old problem. You're not allowed to be mafresh challah on a dough that you made on Erev Yom Tov. So l'chayra, the easiest way to understand this is that the only way this works is if the new dough that you need on Yom Tov generates a new hafrashas challah. So I have a chiyuv to be mafresh challah from a dough that I needed today on Yom Tov, and that I'm allowed to do. So once I'm doing it, I could cover yesterday's Isa as well. And that's what the Mishnah Berurah says over here at the beginning of Ois Katan Chavav. He says, Oid Isa, the dafka b'yesh b'sher challah. But this eitzah only works if the new dough that you need on Yom Tov is large enough to generate a chiyuv of hafrashas challah. Aval be'ein ba kishir. But if the new dough that you need is not large enough to have a share of hafrashas challah, elo de mitzarfa im harishona sheyesh ba, and the only way you're generating a chiyuv of hafrashas challah on the dough that you needed now on Yom Tov is by combining it with yesterday's dough. You see, if you have a dough from Erev Yom Tov that's chayiv and challah, and now you need on Yom Tov a tiny little dough, that tiny little dough is not chayiv and challah. But if you combine it with yesterday's dough, now it is chayiv and challah. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, if that's all that you did, asur, then this eitzah would not work, and you can't be mafresh on today's dough for yesterday's dough. The dummy gemad the mafresh challah me'isa shenilusha me'erev Yom Tov. Because in essence, says the Machzah Shekel, the Pri Begadol Yad Ephraim, in essence, you didn't generate a new chiyuv of hafrashas challah now on Yom Tov that should allow you to be mafresh for yesterday also. You're still working on yesterday's chiyuv of hafrashas challah, and that you're not allowed to be mafresh on Yom Tov. However, the Mishnah Berurah does bring down over here v'yesh bekilin. There are those who are more lenient, and they ruled afilu ein ba kishir. Even if the new dough that you need on Yom Tov is not large enough to generate its own chiyuv hafrashas challah, v'al yedei tzir of sal, and the only reason it has a chiyuv of hafrashas challah is because you combine it with yesterday's dough by putting it together with yesterday's dough in a sal. That's what tzir of sal means. Tzir of sal, if you have two doughs, and if you have two separate doughs, and neither one of them are large enough for a chiyuv of hafrashas challah, and now you want to combine them together to generate a chiyuv, you have to put them both into the same keli. It's complex, the halachas, but tzir of sal, that's what it means. You're putting them together in one basket. Now it becomes one dough, and you generated a chiyuv of hafrashas challah. So therefore, what he's saying over here is there are those that are mekel, and they say afilu ein ba kishir. Even if the new dough that you need on Yom Tov does not have a shear of chiyav hafrashas challah. Val yedei tzir of sal, and you just generate a chiyav by putting it in one basket together with yesterday's dough. You could be mekel and you could be mafresh now on Yom Tov because you want to be mafresh challah on the new dough that you needed today. And the Chavetz Chaim says that in a makam hatchak, if you don't have any challah for Yom Tov and you needed a dough on Erev Yom Tov and you forgot to be mafresh challah, so it's a real shas hatchak. So you could do this. You could knead up a small little dough now, combine it with yesterday's dough, and be mafresh challah. Ois cotton chav zayin. So this eitz is you're gonna need a new dough on Yom Tov v'yitzar feim yachad. And now, and we're going back to the original eitz of the Ramah. We're gonna understand it in a simple way. We're gonna understand you made on Erev Yom Tov, you made one dough that's chayiv and challah. Now on Yom Tov, you make a new dough that's chayiv and challah. And the Ramah said v'yitzar feim yachad. And now put today's new dough together with yesterday's old dough, not to generate a chiyuv challah. Today's new dough is big enough to have its own chiyuv challah. Why are you combining today's dough with yesterday's dough? Because you want to do one hafrasha, you want to separate challah once to cover both doughs. So the Ramah said, v'yitzar feim yachad. You should combine the two doughs, today's dough and yesterday's dough. It explains the Mishnah Berurah. What does this mean? According to what the Mechaber Paskin in Yeridea, in Siman Shin Chaf Hey, in the halachas of challah, how do you combine these two doughs so that you could do one hafrasha for both of them? Shtei isais, if you have two separate doughs, sheyesh ben b'chol achas shir challah, and each one of them is large enough to have its own chiyuv of hafrashas challah, ein tzarech loitzer of kli, it's not necessary to put both doughs inside one keli. V'lo negia, and it's also not necessary for the two doughs to touch each other. Ella, rather, meniach shtein lefanav, you could just put both doughs in front of you, umafrish mizeh al zeh, and you could do one hafrasha from one dough to cover both doughs. And v'hachinami kain, and similarly over here, imahaya b'chol achas kishir. In this eitz of the Ramah, the Chavetz Chaim is explaining, if you have yesterday, Erev Yom Tov's dough, which is chayiv and challah, it's big enough to be chayiv and challah, and you weren't mafresh yesterday. Now today on Yom Tov, you make a new batch, you make another dough that's also big enough to have its own chiyav hafrashas challah. Now you want to make one hafrasha from today's dough, and you want it to cover today's dough and yesterday's dough. You don't have to take both doughs and put them in one keli. You could just put them both in front of you. They don't even have to be touching each other. Not only that, we're going to see, technically, they don't even have to be both in front of you. One could be on the countertop in the kitchen, and the other one could be on the kitchen table. And that's considered lefanav, bayis echad, sirif bayis. Bayis echad is considered lefanav. For sure, one room is considered lefanav. And you could be mafresh once from one dough, and you could cover both doughs. And the truth is that this is a shaila. It happens to be, it comes up a lot. A lot of times women ask this question. They go ahead and they make two batches of challah, or they make one batch of challah and they make another dough for cocoa, shababka, whatever it is. And they have two big doughs, and each one of them are big enough to have their own independent chiyuv of hafrashas challah. And they want to be mafresh one time. So they want to know what do they have to do? What do they have to do in order to be able to do one hafrasha on both doughs? And the answer is they only have to have both doughs in front of them. That's all. As long as both doughs are there, they can make one bracha and do one hafrasha from one dough, having in mind and taking enough that one hafrasha covers both doughs. If you take a look over here in Dirshu footnote number 27, he points out something that I mentioned here. V'afim einon lefanav mamish. The two doughs don't have to be mamish in front of you. Elahein munachais b'bayis ekad, as long as they're both located in the same house. Kasav la'el, Siman Tov Dun Zayin, Siv Katan Zayin. We're going to see that soon in Siman Tov Dun Zayin. Shemet starfais, that those two doughs combine to the extent that one hafrasha will cover them both. V'haisiv sham, and he adds on over there, she'em hein munachais b'kelim nifradim. Let's say the two doughs, each one is in its own keli. So let's say your wife made two different challah doughs, and each one is in its own KitchenAid bowl. She didn't spill them out. Then at least you should put the two bowls next to each other, and they should both be opened on top. And if they're two different types of doughs, to the extent that you would not want the two of them to get mixed up. And this could be like the example that I gave. Let's say you have a challah dough and a babka dough. Not necessarily do you want those two doughs to become intermingled. If the babka dough would get into your challah would turn into cake. And if the challah dough gets into the babka dough, the babka is going to be bland. You're still allowed to do one hafrasha from one of the doughs on both of them. The only time you'll run into a problem is if each dough independently is not big enough to have its own chiyuv of hafrashas challah. If you need, you see, in our case over here, we don't need to combine the two doughs in order to generate a chiyuv of hafrashas challah. Each one of the doughs is already chayiv in its own right in hafrashas challah. The only reason I need to, so to speak, combine the two doughs is because I want to get away with one hafrasha. I want to do one hafrasha from one dough, and I want to cover both doughs. In that case, we're not really looking to combine the two doughs. We just want to cover it with one hafrasha. So then it's enough to have them in bayis echad. If they're in separate kelim, it's enough to have them next to each other. And even if they're two very different types of dough, so that you would be makbid, you wouldn't want them to mix one with the other, it's still enough. You could still make one hafrasha from one to cover both. The only time you'll run into a problem is if you want to combine these two doughs, because alone they're not enough to have a chiyuv of hafrashas challah. You don't have the shear, so now you want to combine them to create a shear of hafrashas challah. Then, if they're two different types of dough and you would be makbid on them mixing, then you would run into a problem. Okay, let's go weiter. Sif Dalet. Hamafresh challah b'Yom Tov v'hi temeya. If somebody is being mafresh challah on Yom Tov, simple case, you made a fresh dough on Yom Tov and you have to be mafresh challah, v'hi temeya, and the challah is tamei. For instance, us nowadays, we're all tamei mesim, so all of our challah is tamei. Now, because the challah is tamei, nobody's eating this challah, right? Nobody can eat this challah. You can't give it to the kohen to eat it. It's challah that's tamei. Lo yafa oisa, you're not allowed to bake the challah, because baking it would be shaloi l'tzarech Yom Tov. That's not tzarech achal nefesh. Nobody's eating it. V'lo yisrafena, you're also not allowed to burn the challah. Why? She'ein sarfin kachim b'Yom Tov. Because there's a halacha, you're not allowed to burn kachim. There are types of kachim that have to be burnt. Noiser has to be burnt. Truma temeya has to be burnt. You're not allowed to burn kachim on Yom Tov. Ella rather manicha ado erev v'sarfa. So what are you going to do with this challah? You're going to set it aside until Matzah Yom Tov, and you'll burn it on Matzah Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois cotton chavches. You have challah v'hi temeya, v'hu adin truma v'challah b'zman hazeh shekulanu tamei mesim. Like truma and challah nowadays, when we're all considered tamei meis. Ois cotton chavches lo yefa isa. You're not allowed to bake this challah. Mishum dehi asura ba'achila. How could you bake it? It's not tzarech achal nefesh. It's asur ba'achila. Nobody's going to eat it on Yom Tov. Now, an interesting point, says the Mishnah Berurah here, v'hu adin, and similarly, sha'asura hi betiltel mitam zeh. Not only are you not allowed to bake the challah is muktzah. Why is it muktzah? Because it has absolutely no purpose on Yom Tov. It's not a meichel that anybody could eat. So what is it usable for? It's not usable for anything. It's muktzah machmas gufa. It's like eitzim va'avonim. It's like sticks and stones in your backyard that are inherently muktzah because they have no Shabbos or Yom Tov purpose. So too, this challah dough has absolutely no Shabbos or Yom Tov purpose, so it's muktzah. You're not allowed to be metaltal it. Oh, however, says the Mishnah Berurah, va'afal pikein, even though I'm telling you that this dough is muktzah and you're not allowed to be metaltal it, miyad kishekara la shem challah, as you make the hafrasha, you pull off a piece of dough. Now you say, Harezu challah. So immediately upon you declaring this piece of dough to be challah, va'adayin hi biyadai kaidem shehinicha, and it's still in your hand and you did not yet put it down, you're allowed to take it and transport it to anywhere that you desire, and leave it over there until chalamayid, and then you could burn it. So what the Mishnah Berurah is pointing out to you over here is like this. I just told you that the challah is muktzah. And not only is it muktzah, it's a very stringent type of muktzah. It's muktzah machmas gufay. It's something which is inherently muktzah because it has absolutely no purpose on Yom Tov. L'chayra, that means as soon as I break off the piece of dough and I say harezu challah, right now I'm holding something that's muktzah. So am I mechuyev to drop it right now wherever I am? No. You're allowed to take it and you could walk wherever you want. You could go out to the backyard, to the shed, if that's where you keep your challah until you burn it. You could transport it as far as you want. You could move it until you put it down, take it to where you want it, and put it down over there, and leave it there until the chalamayid, and on chalamayid you'll burn it. Now there's an interesting footnote here. Footnote number 28. Says the Dirshu footnote here, Amnam. However, Le'el, earlier on in Hilchos Shabbos, is Siman Shin Ches of Katan Yud Gimel, Ubebir Halacha Le'el, and in a Bir Halacha in Siman Reish Samach Vav, Kasav B'Shem Kama Achrayim, it was written, the Chavetz Chaim wrote over there in the name of many Achrayim, Shahaheter Lahamshech L'Taltal Dover Muktzah, La'achar Shu Kvar Nimtza B'Yodai, this heter that exists, that as long as something that's muktzah remains in your hand, you're allowed to take it and move it and carry it to wherever you want to bring it. That heter really only applies to a klisha malachta le'isr. My classic example is when I was a younger bacher in yeshiva, and we were in Yeshiva Staten Island's camp, and I came into my room Friday night to go to sleep, and I found a circular saw on my bed. The guy had left a circular saw on my bed. Now, a circular saw is a klisha malachta le'isr. So I picked up the klisha malachta le'isr. I picked up the circular saw because I have to move it. L'tzarich mekaymai. I need the bed. I need to go to sleep. So you're allowed to move a klisha malachta le'isr l'tzarich mekaymai. So I picked it up. Now the dvar muktzah is in my hand. I'm not mechuyev to put it down on the floor where I'm going to trip on it. I'm allowed to go take it to the guy's storage room, and I'm allowed to put it into his storage room. But what the Dirshu is pointing out over here is that halacha we only find in the context of something like a circular saw, of a klisha malachta le'isr. Ach loy b'davar shedinoi kemuktzah machmas gufay, but we don't find that heter on something which is inherently muktzah. On something that's muktzah machmas gufay, we don't find that heter. And l'chayra, this challah dough is muktzah machmas gufay. So why is the Mishnah Berurah telling me that you're allowed to hold it, you're allowed to transport it to wherever you want? Why aren't you mechuyev to drop it right away? Achein bier again Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zechet Tzadik Levracha explains Shatam shebutel taltal asachala shehifrish. The reason you're allowed to continue to be metaltal the challah that you are mafresh, aval pi shedino kemuktzah machmas gufay, even though l'chayra it's muktzah machmas gufay, hu mipnei shebeshah shalakach haseisa biyadai. The reason is because there's an interesting chilik over here. Over here, when you were mafresh the challah, when you pulled off that piece of dough and you held it in your hand, was it muktzah? No, it wasn't challah yet. So when you took it into your hand, it was not yet muktzah. Lo hoisa adayin muktzah. It wasn't muktzah yet. Ad shekara l'shem. Until you said harezu challah. That's when it became muktzah. V'rak biyada yischadish l'shem muktzah. So the status of muktzah only came onto the piece of dough after the dough was already in my hand. And therefore, it's more kuladik. You see, the eitzim v'avonim, any other thing that's muktzah machmas gufay, it was muktzah before you took it into your hand. But this only became muktzah after it was already in your hand. And therefore, you have this added heter. You could transport it to wherever you want as long as you don't put it down. And according to this logic, Rav Shlomo Zalman Zechet Tzadik Levracha adds an interesting case. Sheha'oichel pri, if somebody eats a fruit, eat a delicious peach, v'nishar hagarin biyadai, and now you're left with the peach pit in your hand. Yitachen, it's possible, it could be that you're allowed to transport it wherever you want, because it's a similar thing. When you picked up the fruit, there was no muktzah here. It's after you finished eating the peach and now there's nothing left but the pit. Now suddenly the pit is something which is muktzah machmas gufay. Till now it was a peach. Now it's a peach pit. A peach pit has no use on Yom Tov or on Shabbos. So it first became muktzah after you already had it in your hand. So now you could go and carry it to the garbage. V'nishar b'tzarich. However, Shlomo Zalman remains with a tzarich iyun on this shaila. Now we go to Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Lamed. So the Mechaber said that you're not allowed to burn challah on Yom Tov because ein sarfin kachim be Yom Tov. She'ein sarfin v'af agav d'sreifas challah tamei mitzvah. Even though there's actually a mitzvah involved in the burning of challah that can't be eaten by a kohen. What exactly this mitzvah is? Either we darshan that challah and truma are similar to kachim, and there is a mitzvah of sreifas kachim. When you have noiser, for instance, there's a beferish mitzvah that you have to burn it. So that's a mitzvah daraisa. So it could be that we compare matanos like truma and challah to kachim. Also, there could be a mitzvah because it's to protect people from a michshol. If we're going to have this challah tameya laying around, somebody might come to eat it. You don't want that to happen. So there's a mitzvah to burn it. Nevertheless, the mitzvah of sreifas challah tameya is not doiche Yom Tov. Shehu asay v'lois asay. Because on Yom Tov, you have an asay to keep Yom Tov, and you have a lois asay that you're not allowed to do malacha. The mitzvah of sreifa is not doicha the asay and the lois asay. Ois Katan Lamed Aleph, manicha ada erev v'sarfa. The words of the Mechaber was that you're going to leave this challah over until after Yom Tov, and then, so manicha ada erev, you're going to leave it until Matzah Yom Tov v'sarfa, and then you're going to burn it. Says the Mishnah Berurah is Katan Lamed Aleph, umashma, the implication of the Mechaber's words are, desarfa balayla, that you're actually going to burn it at night, because that's what the Mechaber says. He says, manicha ada erev, leave it until the evening, leave it until Matzah Yom Tov, and then you'll burn it. The application is you'll burn it at night. V'ayin b'bir halacha ma shekasavnu bazeh, in this bir halacha dibra maschil elo manicha ada erev v'sarfa, he brings down over here from Hagos, from Yeshaya Pick, who says, how are you allowed to burn it on at night? We know that sreifas kachim, you're not allowed to burn kachim at night. And if we're comparing challah to kachim, maybe you shouldn't be allowed to burn it at night. He discusses it in greater detail here in the Bir Halacha. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, v'chol zeh b'chalas Eretz Yisrael shehi asur l'tmeim. This whole halacha pertains to chalas Eretz Yisrael, which is forbidden for consumption by somebody who's tamei. Oy b'chutz la'aretz, or in chutz la'aretz, where the minig is not to give chalas chutz la'aretz to a kayin, even to a kayin that you're sure is not tamei from a tamei hayotze migufay, like tumas keri or tumas ziva. Dainu gadol shetaval, in other words, a kayin, an adult that was tovel in a mikveh, so we know he's tahar. A cotton pachas ben tesha, or a kayin who's a minor child who's less than 9 years old, so we could assume that he never experienced any kind of emission that would be a tumah hayotze migufay. So, for instance, it pertains to us. Our minig is we do not give the challah to a kayin to eat, even to a kayin that we know is tahar, or even to a kayin, a cotton, who we know didn't experience a tumah hayotze migufay. We still don't give them challah to eat. Or in a place where they simply don't have a kayin. But in a locale where the minig is that you do give the chalas chutz la'aretz to a kayin, the yesham kayin, and there's a kayin to give it to, then mutaloyla afaisa, then you're allowed to bake the challah on Yom Tov, because now it's a tzarich Yom Tov. Now you have a kayin who's going to eat it on Yom Tov. Minisbar la'el siman taf nun zay. Okay? Now we go to Sif Hey. Bottom line on Kuf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. Mutter lasais b'Yom Tov pitin gedolim. You are allowed to bake large loaves on Yom Tov, and we're not concerned, shemitoich kach, that once we allow you to bake large loaves, you will now embark on a large baking project, and you're going to bake loaves that you don't need for Yom Tov at all, and you're going to bake for after Yom Tov. What's that play over here? It says the Mishnah Berurah. Ois cotton lamid beis. What the Rebbe Chaber wants to say over here is, these large loaves that they baked apparently were very plain, simple loaves. Pitin, I don't know if that's related to pita or to like a lafa, but it was a plain loaf, a plain round loaf, not braided, not decorated, not anything. And therefore, when you baked these large loaves, he says, there wasn't so much of a tercha. When they made the small challah loaves for Yom Tov, over there's a tercha involved. You have to shape each one and braid them. Therefore, since the baking of the larger loaves involved less tercha than the baking of small loaves, I might have thought that we should worry once somebody's baking simple, big loaves, he might be tempted to bake 20 of them. So maybe we should be worried that he's going to embark on a huge baking project and he's going to bake stuff that there's no tzarich Yom Tov at all. Now, we know that cooking or baking extra is not always asur. If you remember earlier, we said you want to make a big pot of beef stew, you can make as big a pot of beef stew as you want on Yom Tov, even if you only need one piece of beef. The same is true by baking. In certain cases, you're allowed to bake extra, even though you only need one piece of bread. You only need one challah. You need two pieces for lechem mishnah. You need 2 challahs. You want to bake 20 challahs? In certain cases, you're allowed to bake 20 challahs, but in certain cases, you're not. So explains the Mishnah Berurah, v'hainu ba'ofen she'asur. This whole chash that we would have, that maybe we shouldn't allow you to bake big loaves, because if we do, you're going to come to bake extra. That chash is only in a case where the baking of the extra challah would be asur. Kegoin betaner gadol, for example, if you're using a very big commercial oven, then we're not matir you to bake extra breads. You see, if you're using a small oven, so let's say you only need 2 challahs for your lechem mishnah for one meal. You want to go ahead and you want to bake 10 challahs in a small oven in one shot, we're going to let you do it. Why? Because we say that in a small oven, the increased amount of bread makes all the bread taste better. The same way we said in a pot of beef stew. The reason we let you make a big pot of beef stew is because all of that extra meat that you added to the pot, there's a benefit to Yom Tov by that, because it makes the 2 pieces of meat that you're going to eat on Yom Tov taste better. It makes a richer stew when you have more meat in it. So too, when you're baking an oven of bread, whether you bake 2 challahs in a small oven or you fill up the small oven with 10 challahs, the extra 8 challahs make the 2 challahs that you need for Yom Tov taste better. But that's only true in a small oven. In a big oven, it's not true, because you're not filling up the oven anyway. And somehow the odors and the tastes of the other challahs don't get into the challah that you're using on Yom Tov. So in a big oven, we're not going to let you do that. Or another thing we don't allow, we would allow you to bake extra challahs if you're putting everything in at one shot, but we would not allow you to bake extra challahs if you're doing extra work, if you're filling up the oven again and again and again and again, then we don't allow you to bake extra challahs. And now the Mishnah Berurah spells this out. The betan or cotton, when you're dealing with a small oven, or bepam achas, if it's a small oven and you're putting everything in at one time, we don't care if you bake extra, because it makes all the pas taste better. And similarly, you're allowed to bake little thin biscuits. You're allowed to go ahead. You want to make cookies on Yom Tov? Maybe, would you have a havamina? No, I don't want you to make little bilkalach. Little bilkalach is an extra amount of tircha. Every little bilkalach has to be braided. No, you're allowed to do that because that's a tzarich Yom Tov. Okay. Sifhei. Oh, sorry, we did this already. So we started Sifhei. Here we're going to turn the page now. So let's just read from the beginning of Sif Hey. Okay, Sivav, Kufkav Aleph Amud Beis. Let's say a Yid owns flour, or he has a dough that is a partnership between him and a non-Jew. So a guy has a 50-pound sack of flour, and it's half his, and it's half a non-Jew's. Or he has a little baking operation together with a non-Jew, and they made a big dough, and now this dough is owned 50% by me and 50% by the non-Jew. Asr la'afaisa b'Yom Tov, you're not allowed to bake this dough on Yom Tov, and in the case of the flour, you're not allowed to knead the flour into a dough on Yom Tov, because by doing so, you're being matriach, you're doing a tircha, you're exerting yourself, not only for yourself, l'tzarech Yom Tov, you're also exerting yourself for the non-Jew. So if you have a dough that's owned by you and by a non-Jew, when you go ahead and you bake it, half of the challah is going to be yours, half of the challah is going to be a non-Jew. What right do you have to bake a non-Jew's challah on Yom Tov? What right do you have to take a non-Jew's flour on Yom Tov and go ahead and knead it into a dough? Half the dough is yours, half the dough is the guy's. So that means that you exerted yourself on Yom Tov, not l'tzarech Yom Tov, not for a tzarech for yourself or what you need for Yom Tov. You exerted yourself for the non-Jew on Yom Tov. Not allowed to do that on Yom Tov. Ella, rather, says the Mechaber, Yechalkena v'yefe es shaloi. Rather, what you have to do is, you have to do a division. You have to divide with the guy and say, this is mine, this is yours. And you go ahead and you work with yours. You need your flour into a dough. You bake your dough into a challah. But you're not allowed to do his. Says the Mishnah Berurah is Katan Lam and Gimel. Also, la'afaisa, you're not allowed to bake it. Hainu be'isa. When the Mechaber says you're not allowed to bake, he's referring to the case where you own a dough in the shutfis with the non-Jew. Uva kemach, and when it comes to flour that you own in a shutfis with a non-Jew, asar afilu lolush, you're not allowed to knead it into a dough. Now, the Mishnah Berurah points out that this is not similar to an earlier case where we spoke about a case where you have a shutfis with a non-Jew and you are allowed to do a malach on Yom Tov. This is not the same as the case where you have an animal that you own in a partnership with a non-Jew, the mutar l'shachta b'Yom Tov, where we said you're allowed to shech the animal. So if you own a cow in a partnership with a non-Jew and you want to shech the cow on Yom Tov so you can make a roast, you're allowed to. And we don't say that, hey, wait a second, you can shech. If you shech the cow, you're doing shechita not only for yourself, you're also doing shechita for the non-Jew. So you're exerting yourself for the non-Jew. No, we don't say that. By shechita, we say you're allowed to shech the animal, even though part of it belongs to the non-Jew. Kanal b'simin tav tzad chesef yod aleph. Why? The shari hasam, because that case of shechita is different. The ef shel kazayis basar below shechita. I want a brisket. There's no way for me to render my brisket mutter without me doing a shechita. I have to do the same shechita to render one kazayis of this animal mutter. It's the same shechita as for the whole animal. So you can't tell me that I'm exerting myself for the non-Jew. No, I'm not. 100% of the exertion that I'm doing in the shechita is for my brisket, because I need a full shechita for my brisket. So the whole shechita is l'tzarech Yom Tov, is l'tzarech me. That's not the same over here. Over here, you're going to bake a challah, and half the challah is going to belong to him. So you baked his half of a challah. You want to bake a half a challah, so make a division and make yourself a small challah. And then you have to do less exertion. Over here, make a division and only be matriach for your chelik. You can't be matriach, you can't bake his stuff. This is true even if you're putting everything in one oven. Cotton, and even if you're using a small oven. The pasuk abachaber lekamam b'simin tavkav zayin tzivav demot alefais taner moli pas ava pishein tzarech elo lapasachas. We just spoke this out before. This is even true, even though we said that really when you're using a small oven, you're allowed to put extra bread in the oven on Yom Tov because it makes all the bread taste better. So why don't we say the same thing over here? Why don't we say, okay, so you're baking bread for the non-Jew. but the non-Jew's bread is going to make your bread taste better. So isn't that a tzarich Yom Tov? You're allowed to do this normally. No, the shani hasam, that case is different. Because in that case where we said it's mutter, shekala pas shel Yisrael, in that case all the bread belongs to the Yid, or rishus biyadai lechol kalechad ve'echad oizeh oizeh. You see, when a Yid only needs 2 challahs for his lechem mishnah, but he wants to bake 10 challahs in a tanner cotton, we allow him to do it. Why? Because we say, look, the bottom line is all 10 challahs are going to be yours. And you don't know which challah you're going to eat. Maybe when all the challahs come out, you'll decide that one is the prettiest. I want to use that one. That one is a little less done. I like a less done challah. So there are 10 challahs over here. Every one of them has a chance it might get eaten on Yom Tov. You have a choice. You could eat any one you want. Not only that, for Oid, and furthermore, says the Mishnah Berurah, maybe they'll all get eaten. Dilma makalale archim, maybe guests will come. The chazakulu Yom Tov. And guess what? You will use 10 challahs, even though you thought you only needed 2. So when all the challahs belong to a Yid, we allow him to bake extra challahs on Yom Tov if it's a small oven, and therefore all of the challahs in the oven are going to get improved. But over here in our case, where half of the challah belongs to a non-Jew, the muchrach lahasher chelkai, so you have to leave him what belongs to him. You're not allowed to eat it. So no matter how you slice it, you're definitely being matriach. You're definitely exerting yourself for something that belongs to the guy that you're going to have to give to the guy, that you're not going to consume on Yom Tov. And the excuse you want to use is, I'm going to be matriach and I'm going to bake the non-Jews challah because by filling up the oven, it's going to improve my challah. On that alone, Asr, that we're not going to be matter you to bake extra bread just on the heter, that the extra bread is going to make your Yom Tov challah taste better. When do we say that? When anyway there's a chance that the extra bread that you're going to make on Yom Tov, you will end up using on Yom Tov, because maybe guests will come. Or at least there's a chance that you'll choose to use that challah and not that challah. So all of the challahs have a chance that they'll be used on Yom Tov. Then we use the svara that extra bread in the oven makes all the bread taste better, so you could do it on Yom Tov and call it a tzarich Yom Tov, but not when you're baking for the non-Jew. Siv Zayin. Im yesh la'adam harbe pas nikia. Let's say a person baked for Yom Tov, and he has a lot of pas nikia. What's pas naki? Beautiful soiles, beautiful white bread that was made out of very, very highly refined flour. So you have choshev challah for Yom Tov, and you have plenty of it. Einoi oifa pas acheres. You're not allowed to go now on Yom Tov and bake more bread. Ella in ken yesh loy b'nei bayis sherogil lahachilam pas hadra. So what the Mechaber is saying over here is, you have plenty of pas naki. You have plenty of wonderful bread. Can you go ahead now and bake new bread? Well, let's say you decide you want whole wheat bread. Could you go ahead and decide you want to bake whole wheat bread? Says the Mechaber, no. You have better bread. You have pas naki. Pas naki in halacha, despite what we might think nowadays, pas naki in halacha is considered more chashuv than whole wheat bread, which is called pas hadra or pas kiber in halacha. So you can't turn around now on Yom Tov and say, you know what, I want to bake some additional inferior quality bread. That's not called a tzarich Yom Tov. Ella in Cain, unless yesh loy b'nei bayis. Let's say you have family members, sherogil lahachiram pas hadra, and they usually eat whole wheat bread. So they're used to whole wheat bread, and they want whole wheat bread. And it's true you have pas naki, but you don't have what they want for Yom Tov. Okay, so if they're rugil and whole wheat bread, and you don't have whole wheat bread, you could go bake whole wheat bread. Aval, however, im yesh like pas hadra harbe, but let's say you have plenty of whole wheat bread for Yom Tov. Yachalefa is pas nikia. You decide you want some more chashav challah, you want pas naki, you could go bake pas naki, because that's more chashav. So in a nutshell, what the Mechaber is saying over here in Siv Zayin is, if you have plenty of superior quality challah, You can't now go ahead and decide you want to bake some inferior quality challah. Why? You have plenty of superior quality challah. We're not going to let you go ahead and do this baking shaloi l'tzarich. What are you doing it for? If you have somebody who he grew up on whole wheat bread, he doesn't like pasnaki. So then you can make him pas hadra. If you have plenty of inferior quality bread and you want to make more chashiva bread, then you're allowed to do that. That's kavod Yom Tov. That's tzarich Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah is kat lamed hey. Harbe pas nikia. If somebody has plenty of beautiful white challah, shemaspik loy l'chalayoyim, he has what he needs for Yom Tov. Ais kat lamed vav einei oifa. So he's not allowed to go ahead and bake more now. Bein pas nikia ubein pas hadra hainu pas kiber. He can't bake more pasnaki. He doesn't need it. You can't go bake what you don't need on Yom Tov, and he's also not allowed to make inferior quality. He can't go bake whole wheat bread. You have beautiful white bread. You can't go bake whole wheat bread. You have something that's of superior quality. You can't go now on Yom Tov and bake inferior quality. Venerally, the Chofetz Chaim says, it seems to me that this halacha is only true if it's the same type of bread. Min acher, but if it's a different type of bread. So like this is, I have plenty of wheat bread, and now I want to make barley bread, or I want to make spelt bread. Then I feel a Berurah mizeh. If you have plenty of white challah, and now you want to make whole grain spelt challah, you could do that. Shari, that would be mutter. Ice cotton lamed zayin. The Mechaber said if you have plenty of pasnaki, you're not allowed to go bake pas acheres. You're not allowed to go bake other bread. But there's a catch here. If you want to go ahead, you have plenty of challah. You have 25 challahs, beautiful pasnaki challahs. But you have a hankering Yom Tov in the morning. You want to go put up a fresh batch of challah because you want to have warm challah. That's fine. If you want warm, fresh, straight out of the oven challah, and the beautiful white challah that you have was baked yesterday on Erev Yom Tov, shari lefayisafilu pas hadra. Then you're allowed to make even fresh whole wheat challah. You want to have fresh, beautiful, straight out of the oven, fresh challah? That's tzarich Yom Tov. You're allowed to do that even if you have plenty of white challah from yesterday. Ois cotton lamed ches. But the Mechaber said, if you have family members who are used to eating whole wheat bread, but they buy sherogil, umashpa, the implication of the words of the Mechaber is the be'enam regilim, if they're not used to eating whole wheat bread. And just now you decided you want to give them whole wheat bread, asr. So the Mishnah Berurah is saying is this heter of the Mechabers, when the Mechaber says, if you have family members that are used to eating pas hadra, then you're allowed to bake pas hadra on Yom Tov, even if you have plenty pasnaki. That's where they're used to eating pas hadra. Not because you decided, you know what, today I want to give them whole wheat bread. No, you have white bread, you got to use the white bread. Ice cotton lametes. Aval, however, in Yeshloi, the Mechaber said, if you have plenty of inferior quality challah, if you have plenty of whole wheat challah, and you want to make white challah, that you're allowed to do. I'm Magen Avram. The mutal lechatchila lefais pas hadra v'achakach pas nikia. There's a little bit of a harama here that the Magen Avram says you're allowed to make. You could go ahead and I'm going to bake a batch of white challah and I'm going to bake a batch of whole wheat challah. Then you say to yourself, wait a second. If I bake the batch of white challah first, then I'm not going to be allowed to bake the whole wheat challah because the batch of white challah that I'm going to make is really enough challah for the whole Yom Tov. And once I have enough white challah for the whole Yom Tov, the Mechaber just told me I'm not allowed to bake whole wheat challah. So what am I going to do? Elamai, I'll use a trick. I'll bake the whole wheat flour first, the whole wheat challah first. And now even though I have enough whole wheat challah for today, I could still go bake white challah because white challah is more chashuv. So it's a little bit of a harama that the Magen Avram says you're allowed to do. But v'dafke im roitze lecha pas hadra, that's only true if you want to eat the whole wheat challah. Avalim kavanose laharim sheyavasa lachol. But if you're trying to do this so that you should be able to have leftover challah for after Yom Tov for the weekday, that bevadai is also. Sivches says the Mechaber. Also, you're not allowed to make sourdough on Yom Tov, ela al yidei shinoi, only by employing a shinoi, because the making of sourdough is something that you could have done before Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah is cutting mem. Also, you're not allowed to make sourdough. That means lahachmit to isa, to make a dough rise and ferment. Because he could have done it before Yom Tov. Because when you're baking challah, when you're baking bread, there's no difference in the quality of the bread or the challah, whether you use yeast whether you use sourdough that was made today or you use sourdough that was made before Yom Tov. So there's no cost to Yom Tov by making the sourdough on Erev Yom Tov. So you make the sourdough on Erev Yom Tov. And the Mishnah Berurah points out, you should know the svarazu, that this halacha that we just said, this l'chayra goes according to the second opinion that we had in Siman Taf Tzadikei in the Ramah, the gamba oichel nefesh gufa, that even by things that are being done for oichel nefesh purposes, machmirinon, we rule stringently, be'enoi meifik tam klal, where there's no cost to Yom Tov at all, where the taste of the thing that you're making is not diminished at all. Am I say on Erev Yom Tov, if you made it on Erev Yom Tov, what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is, this halacha of the Mechabers, the Mechaber just said over here, you're not allowed to make sourdough because you could have made the sourdough before Yom Tov. Well, the first opinion in Siman Taf Tzadikei says that when it comes to malachas that you're doing for Eichel Nefesh, it doesn't matter. Any malacha that you're doing for Eichel Nefesh, even if there would have been no cost to Yom Tov, if you would have done it before Yom Tov, you're allowed to do it on Yom Tov. Eichel Nefesh, cooking, you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, even if it's true that if you would have done that cooking on Erev Yom Tov, it would have tasted just as good. It doesn't matter. So too over here, there's no cost to Yom Tov if you use sourdough from yesterday. The Mechaber is saying, therefore, you're not allowed to do it on Yom Tov because you should have done it yesterday. That goes according to the second opinion in Taf Tzadikei, that even by Eichel Nefesh, there's a difference between something that you could have done yesterday and something that you could not have. Finally, Sif Test to close out Siman Tov Kovav. Afilu nishchata habehema me'erev Yom Tov. We started off here saying we were talking about the halacha of hafrashas challah, and we said that if you make a dough on Erev Yom Tov, you're not allowed to be mafresh challah from it on Yom Tov. Why? Because there's a problem of nira kemisake. It looks like you're fixing the dough. Until you were mafresh challah, you weren't supposed to eat from the dough. Now that you're mafresh challah, you're allowed to eat from the dough. So you were misaket it. You fixed it when you were mafresh challah. So that looks like the malacha makah b'patish. So you mixed up a dough on Erev Yom Tov, you can't be mafresh challah on Yom Tov. Now the Mechaber points out here, even if you shecht an animal on Erev Yom Tov, you're allowed to give the matanas that go to a kohen. When you shecht an animal, parts of the animal are given to the kohen. Now you might have thought that those matanas are the same as challah. The same way, if you make a dough, you can't be on Erev Yom Tov, you can't be mafresh challah on Yom Tov. Maybe if you shecht an animal on Erev Yom Tov, you're not allowed to be mafresh the matanas on Yom Tov. Maybe you have to be mafresh the matanas on Erev Yom Tov. Says the Mechaber, no, over here it's different. You could be mafresh the matanas, the zraya, the lachayayim, and the keva, the portions of the animal that are given to the kohen. You could be mafresh those on Yom Tov, even if you did the shechita before Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah, motel hafrashas matanas b'Yom Tov. Why? Mishum de'eina misakein. Because over here there is no nira kemisakein. The gam kaidam hafrasha loy tavlan. Because an animal is not considered tevel before you give the matlis kahuna. You're allowed to eat the basar of an animal even before you give the zraya and the lechayayim and the keva to the kohen. So you're not fixing anything. The animal was mutter b'achila before you gave the matanais, and it's mutter b'achila after you gave the matanais. So there's no problem of nirika misakein. For oid, and there's another reason why you're allowed to be mafresh the matanais from an animal, the hafrashas v'amdais beguf habehema, because there's a big difference between being mafresh challah and being mafresh the zraya, the lechayayim, and the keva. When you're mafresh challah, so you have a dough. What part of the dough is challah? None of it is challah until I grab a piece, pull it off, and say I raise with challah. So that's a real hafrasha. That's a real maisa of hafrasha. By the animal, the zeraya, the right foreleg, the lechayayim, the jaws, the cave of the stomach, those are all distinct before I'm even mafresh them. So you're not doing much of a hafrasha, and therefore it is mutter on Yom Tov. Okay, Baruch Hashem, we picked up a page. I think now we are only one amud behind the Dirshu schedule. So thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be Megan and Gans Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom should send Yeshua's refuahs and parnasa to all those in need. And we should all be zeich to see the Bias Goyal Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.